showing how actually Jesus sometimes deliberately uses contradictions as a way of teaching. We know that good teachers use what's called paradox. And Jesus says in John's gospel, both, I didn't come to judge the world, and for judgment I came into the world. He says both of them. And he does things like this, I judge no one, yet even if I do judge. So you get these sorts of sayings. And I say, look, if Jesus on his own lips is allowed to say two contrary things, not completely contrary, but at least at the linguistic level, they're contrary, they're a paradox, then but actually you're meant to recognize from that, if you think that there's some deeper truth we're supposed to explore from that. Why would we think that if I've got one text that I struggle to fit together with another text across, say, two different gospels, that the only rational thing to do is to suppose that these are loggerheads with each other, rather than that these two are actually trying to invite me to think more deeply about some deeper truth? So I think...
Well, thank you for watching another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Peter Williams. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Great to be with you.
Thank you for accepting our invitation again. You were one of our first guests years ago. We talked about the Old Testament and some of the passages in there that are challenging. I'm not sure if you remember that, but that was when we were just doing the audio podcast. So today I'm excited to talk about your new book on the Gospels. But before we dive into that, can you just give our audience a little bit of background?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about writing this little book on the reliability of the Gospels for about 20 years. I've been going around various places speaking about whether we can trust the Gospels. And essentially, I wanted to get a book that's really short, and it's short enough to be able to be given out to friends who just may be thinking about this for the first time, but also it have content that any Christian, someone who's been a Christian for many decades, is still going to benefit from. So I tried to keep it very short. I was aiming for 35,000 words. I think I got to 38, so slightly overspelt, but there we are. It's still, nice and thin.
Awesome. And give us a little bit of background just about you personally.
Yeah, so I'm English. I grew up in a Christian family. I've been in university since 1989 in various ways. And I've been involved trying to research the Bible. And I originally did that because I wanted to become a Bible translator. And with time, I realized that actually there was a great need of Bible translators. There's also a need for just people to be scholars of the Bible to try and help build up the church. And so that's been my calling. And I have the privilege of leading a wonderful institution called Tyndale House, which you can find online at tyndalehouse.com, which is one of the world's leading centers for research on the Bible. So we have lots of people who study the Bible very deeply here.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So let's just dive into the topic. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart because I wouldn't have gotten into apologetics had it not been for my New Testament course and Bart Ehrman being our textbook. And so he has a lot to say, I'm sure you know, about the reliability of the Gospels. And so this was a question that I wrestled with deeply. When you talk to people who are skeptical about the Gospels, what is really the first kind of challenge they have?
Well, there are many. I think there's a big challenge that people simply don't know the Gospels and don't know the evidence for the Gospels. But I think we probably need to divide people into two groups. One is just the general person in the public who really knows nothing. And then we've got people who have studied religion and these sorts of things in a more formal setting and maybe educated themselves a bit more. Because I think they actually have two different sorts of objection. I think that someone who knows nothing, often they have this idea that everything could have been made up hundreds and hundreds of years later. It could be made up by some emperor, some pope, a long time later. That's the general idea. But then people who know a little bit more know that that won't work. And their objections tend to be much more specific. It's how does this gospel fit with that gospel? And there's a specific model that people have worked out to try and explain things without appeals to the supernatural. So I think there are two different groups. And one of the things I'm doing in my book is simply saying, actually, everyone agrees, including Bart Ehrman, that the gospel writers really knew an awful lot about the place where these events are set, Jerusalem, Galilee, and so on. Everyone just assumes this. Well, actually, that's quite new to many people, the idea that we can show the gospel writers had a lot of cultural and historical familiarity. So I want to just establish that as a starting point.
Mm-hmm. I know one of the major challenges that Ehrman raised in his book that I'm sure you probably touched on was the dating of the Gospels, and dating them later creates a problem for their reliability. How do you navigate with that question? Do you interact with the
yeah, I do. I've got a table of his dates in my book somewhere. And I think the wonderful thing is, here we are, Ehrman's dates on page 48. And the wonderful thing is I say, okay, let's go with his dates. I think they're too late, but let's go with his dates. Even then, the Gospels are within a plausible memory time. Now, of course, he would make the argument that it doesn't take long to corrupt the memory. I would make the argument that my granny's 98 and she can remember things from the Second World War like they were yesterday. So I think that you can play the length of time either way. My argument in the book is that we can make a case that the Gospels are first generation documents. I'm not interested in putting particular dates on them, but also that we can show that there's really good material in here. We can explain one gospel and another gospel and how they have subtle agreements with each other best by assuming that they're both speaking the truth. He doesn't have an explanation for those sorts of agreements you get between the gospels. So I'd want to say, even using his dates, I'm very happy with making a case for the reliability of the gospels. I think you can make an argument that they're earlier than he says.
Another objection I know that comes up is who wrote the Gospels. We assume Matthew because his name Matthew, but there's a little dispute in that. How do you navigate that in your book?
Well, I mean, if you take Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Mark and Luke would be nobodies if it weren't for their Gospels. So it's a bit like J.K. Rowling. She would be nobody if people hadn't read her works about Harry Potter and so on. So it's Mark and Luke, the Gospels, that make Mark and Luke the authors famous. So there's no motive you can have for putting the names Mark and Luke on, because they're not even one of the 12 disciples. Matthew and John, it's different. They are from the 12 disciples. But in Matthew, I show in my book how Matthew is said to be a tax collector, but hey, there's a huge amount of financial interest in Matthew's gospel, things that you don't get mentioned elsewhere. The treasures of the wise men, the price paid to the bribe paid to the guards, the bribe money given to Judas, and so on. These are the sorts of things you're getting in Matthew's gospel. It really fits. Likewise, John's gospel seems to be by an eyewitness, and when you work through the plausible people that it can be, who can be at all of those events, you can make a very good case it's John. The other thing I'd say is that there is a standard attribution, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all four Gospels, that is best explained if that's been there from the beginning. The Gospels aren't anonymous. They've been circulated with those names as far as back as we can go. So I think the case you can make for John's Gospel is stronger. Being by John is stronger than you can make for Plato's dialogues being by Plato. I mean, if you look at the manuscript evidence for John and for Plato, and when things are said to be by them, you can actually make a case that actually you've got more evidence for John than you have for Plato. And yet people are quite happy to accept that Plato wrote this and so on. With many classical works, people just accept it. So I'd say if you forget the sort of culture wars that people have about skepticism versus believing and so on, actually, and just look at it like you would a classical or historical work, you would not be having this conversation. You'd say, yeah, that makes sense. It's realistic.
I know one of the challenges with the dating is the temple, uh, the destruction of the temple. So people would say, well, because they deny the supernatural aspect, that it had to be dated later,
Yeah.
because how would they have known
Mhm.
the prophecy? How do you engage with that?
Well, I mean, again, just very briefly, but if Jesus is the Son of God, there isn't much of a problem him knowing the future. So if people want to bring in their secular presuppositions say prophecy can't happen. In a sense, it's junk in, junk out. I mean, like just with any coding or whatever it is, the input has defined the output. So if they say there can be no miracle, then of course they're going to conclude there was no prophecy. That's not an argument. That's just starting with your presuppositions. But what I want to say is, when you look at the person of Jesus presented in the Gospels, there's a whole load of converging lines of evidence that he really is someone absolutely remarkable. He is the first person to whom is attributed the positive form of the golden rule: do unto others what you'd have them do to you. He teaches amazing parables, and if it wasn't him who made them up, he had amazingly inventive disciples who gave him all the credit, which is a far more complex hypothesis than supposing that there was one genius in the first place, because you have to invent multiple super generous geniuses who come up with these ideas and then attribute them all to the same person. I mean, it starts becoming absurd. But also, Jesus died not just according to the Gospels, but also according to the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud. He died on the eve of Passover. That's the greatest time of when the Jews remember their greatest deliverance. When he died, there's an on the third day there is no body, there's an empty tomb, and there are many people, varied people, who say they've seen him. Morning and evening, in town, out of town, Judea, Galilee, men, women, all sorts of different groups. And when you start trying to put this all together, and also the fact that his death seems to fulfill so much of the expectation that is already built up in the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, which are remarkable things in themselves. And you start saying, actually, what we've got with Jesus is we've got these converging patterns of something remarkable. So when we appeal to miracles, like Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, we're not appealing to things that spoil the pattern of predictable science. We're actually saying, no, there is a pattern made by Jesus himself. He is the pattern. He's the center of the pattern. So I don't believe in random miracles. I don't believe in meaningless miracles. I believe every miracle has a meaning. And so what we have with the New Testament miracles is we have a strong converging pattern signal pointing to how Jesus is remarkable.
Mm-hmm. What for you was the most challenging portion of your book to write as it relates to the reliability of the New Testament?
I think one of the biggest challenges, for me, one of the biggest challenges, just to make it brief, I mean, I had to leave out lots of things. And there was a very brief chapter I did on contradictions. I would love to have made that longer, but I just left it as it was, very brief, showing how actually Jesus sometimes deliberately uses contradictions as a way of teaching. We know that good teachers use what's called paradox. And Jesus says in John's gospel, both, I didn't come to judge the world, and for judgment I came into the world. He says both of them. And he does things like this, I judge no one, yet even if I do judge. So you get these sorts of sayings. And I say, look, if Jesus on his own lips is allowed to say two contrary things, not completely contrary, but at least at the linguistic level, they're contrary, they're a paradox, then but actually you're meant to recognize from that, if you think that there's some deeper truth we're supposed to explore from that, why would we think that if I've got one text that I struggle to fit together with another text across, say, two different gospels, that the only rational thing to do is to suppose that these are loggerheads with each other, rather than that these two are actually trying to invite me to think more deeply about some deeper truth? So I think the problem with this whole idea of contradictions is it's become a point scoring exercise where, skeptics put out on the web their lists of contradictions in the Bible. They've never really looked that closely at the message that there is behind these, and Christians can have a knee-jerk reaction to try and give simplistic answers when actually the Christian message is saying there's lots of simple things here, but also there's lots of very deep things here. So our aim is not to give too quick a fix to issues, but actually to say there's an invitation here in the scriptures to explore the wonderful truths they contain.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful, because that's one of the first objections you get for the people who want to dismiss the scriptures is it's full of contradictions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always funny because sometimes you say, well, name one, and they can't actually give you one. So,
well, and I would say, name 10, because naming one doesn't really show you very much. So Charles Dickens began his work, The Tale of Two Cities. He said, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's his opening sentence. Now, no one shuts the book at that point and says, well, this guy clearly doesn't know how to write. It's just nonsense. Actually, you say, well, I wonder what he means by that. And I think that people need to come to the Gospels, come to the Bible with the attitude, I wonder what's meant by that, rather than, oh, is there something I can try and catch out a Christian on? So I think we need, you've got to come with the right attitude to these texts.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the Gospels, for you, outside of what was the most challenging thing to write, what's the most challenging thing as far as the objection to the reliability of the Gospels?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest problems that often comes up, in fact, around Christmas time, people mention, of course, the census that you have in Luke chapter 2, where it's said to be in the time of Quirinius. Now, one of the things here is simply we don't know enough. But there is this question about whether Quirinius was governor at the right time. And what you've got to remember here is we got one source, which is Luke, and we got another source, which is Josephus. And they don't obviously fit together. But if one of them has to be wrong, why do I have to say Luke got it wrong? Why can't I say Josephus got it wrong? So I'd want to say that's the worst problem you get to, possibly in the New Testament, is that one text in New Testament doesn't fit with a text outside the New Testament. Now, that doesn't mean I think we need to throw in the towel on Luke. I think Luke's probably 10 years older than Josephus, closer to the events. I'd want to make a case for Luke, but there may be ways that you can say that both Luke and Josephus are correct. And people write at great length about that. So that's a particular problem. But the way I'd look at it is like this. Sometimes people come to me and they have an endless list of objections. And I say, look, I'm not interested in your long lists. I'm only interested in 2 questions. And the 2 questions are, what's your most difficult question? And what's your most important question? The most important question might be something that really touches them personally. The most difficult question, I want to say with your most difficult question, look, if I can answer your most difficult objection, are you prepared to accept that all your less difficult objections could be answered? Because that makes sense. That if I can answer the hardest one, then all the other ones can be dealt with. So I'd say let's sort of set some ground rules before we even begin discussing, and say, what would a good answer look like? What will you do if I give a good answer? You're going to read a gospel, come to church. What are you going to do? Let's have that discussion, and I'm going to commit to them, because I'll tell them what I'm going to do. I'm going to be very frank with them. I'll tell them how much homework I'm going to do, how much I'm not going to do. I just want to be honest with people. And so I say, look, you've got this objection. If I can really give you an answer to that, are you prepared to accept that the other ones can be dealt with? Because I think that's what people should honestly do. I sometimes have in public, people ask me, I say, I've got 2 questions. I say, great, ask me the more difficult one. I don't want both questions. I want you. And sometimes I've had them say, no, you choose. And I say, no, you choose, because then you're saying this is the more difficult one. Because otherwise some people are not actually sincerely inquiring. They just simply want to have a huge list of questions, and they just keep the Christian very busy, on scurrying around trying to find answers. And I think, no, we've got to discuss in an honest way. That's from both sides, and that means we have to commit, and we have to commit to doing the homework to give good answers. But likewise, we're asking people, look, if you're sincere about this, you're not going to dash off, without waiting for an answer. Also applies online. I mean, yeah, there are plenty of not very sincere people online, and one of the hallmarks is they don't wait around for an answer. They're not actually interested in any of that.
I think that's helpful in everyday engagement for people who are trying to engage people, trying to give a defense, but also trying to be strategic and wise with the way they engage people. So I appreciate that advice. One of the things that comes to mind when I think about the reliability of the New Testament, I think about the woman caught in the act of adultery. And we've had Dr. Dan Wallace on, and we talked about that, and he talked about how that text has been moved around in the New Testament over years. It wasn't always in John. For those who are thinking about that and saying, if this is in there, and I mean, when you look in your Bible, there's usually a note that this wasn't in the original manuscript. Why should I trust the other portions of it if this could be added?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's a great passage, but I don't think it's part of John's gospel. And one way I look at it is that passage is actually a very good argument for the reliability of the gospels. And the way it works is this: that the first printed Greek, entire printed and published Greek New Testament was by Erasmus about in 1516, so 500 years ago, and he had only 2 manuscripts of the Gospels, and his manuscript, he actually said explicitly that passage is not in the majority of manuscripts that are available to him. Now, he had other ones, but he only used 2 in his edition. And we've had more manuscripts come to light over the last 500 years, earlier manuscripts, and the situation with the evidence hasn't changed. So it's not that, oh no, there's suddenly been a discovery that this is not in. Actually, if you look right down the history of the church, most manuscripts, most commentaries, most church lectionary systems, the liturgy and so on, don't contain this passage. So why is it in our Bibles? Well, I think it certainly is an early passage, and it was in the Latin Bibles, and it was in some of the Greek ones. And that meant that at the time of the Reformation, when Erasmus was making his edition, he was a Catholic. He wasn't going to take something out of the Latin Bible when he could find it in some of the Greek manuscripts. So of course, he left that in. But I'd want to say the great thing about this is in a passage like that, and Dr. Dan Wallace has already explained that it's actually found in various places in New Testament manuscripts. You get, if you like, a bit of an explosion, a bit of chaos in the manuscripts. What's that show you? Firstly, it shows you there's been no central power controlling all of these manuscripts. There's no Pope, there's no Greek Orthodox patriarch, there's no emperor who's controlling all the manuscripts. The manuscripts are in different monasteries, different places. No one's controlling it. That's really good news, because that means that there's been no cover-up anywhere. And so it's in that passage, and also at the end of Mark, where you've got another 12-verse passage that's uncertain. Those are the only 2 places where you have anything of that length where there's doubt. And the great thing is they were known 500 years ago. We've discovered many more manuscripts. Nothing new like that is coming up. And so we're able to say that if future discoveries are anything like past discoveries will be, and we've had 500 years of discovery, so we should think, future discoveries should be somewhat predictable. If they're anything like the pattern in the past, we are not expecting any other passage to become uncertain. So I'd want to say, in a sense, those 2 passages provide a very good control sample, because they show to us that if someone does tamper with something, we get a bit of a chaotic pattern in manuscripts. At the end of Mark, some have the longer ending, some have a shorter ending, some have a longer and a shorter ending, some have no ending, and that's great, because that shows there's no central control. So I'm quite encouraged overall, because I would say a passage like that is early, but it's not part of the original, and it shows us that people can't tamper with the text in the Middle Ages or earlier and not have that show up in our manuscripts today. We've got manuscripts from all over the place that are in different legal jurisdictions and have been in different legal jurisdictions in the past. There's never been anyone in history, an emperor, pope, or anyone, who's able to control everyone's Bibles. And that's really encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a helpful way, a way I've never thought to look at it, because I know it is a challenge for many, like you mentioned, the longer ending of Mark and the woman caught in the act of adultery. It's interesting, though, that the woman caught in the act of adultery is one of the most famous passages of scripture that everybody loves, because it shows.
Well, I mean, and I think it's a passage which is very reflective. It thinks deeply about the Old Testament. I'm not saying it's not a genuine event. I'm just saying it's not part of the earliest form of John's Gospel. So, you know, if I'm teaching from that passage, I want to teach how the passage flows from chapter 7 through to 8. I want people to get that. But it's you know, I certainly don't want to you know, attack Christians who defend that passage. In fact, the way I wrote the book was deliberately so that Christians, whatever their view is on these sorts of things, can unite round the fact that you know, we can have confidence in the text of the Gospels. And a passage like that doesn't make the other passages uncertain or less certain. It's a bit like if you're listening to someone's talk and you miss a phrase, it doesn't make all of the other phrases in the talk uncertain. If you miss a bit of a film, it doesn't make all of the rest of the film uncertain. And so there's this slightly crazy logic that people have adopted that somehow someone's uncertainty about this passage creates uncertainty, for instance, about the opening of John's Gospel. Well, look, the opening of John's Gospel in all the manuscripts is incredibly solid. We know exactly the sequence of words. They've been, you know, recited for ages in all sorts of different countries, in all sorts of different translations. You know, you can't change any of them. So I'd want to say, focus on the evidence we have for so much which is unchanged.
That's helpful. For those who want to get your book, how can they get your book?
Well, there's this thing called Amazon, although it seems to be running out. So it's called Can We Trust the Gospels? And it's also available from Crossway, the publisher, from Mardell, from various other outlets. So, you know, lots of ways of purchasing it online, and you can even buy bulk and get some discount, because I do think it's the sort of thing you can give out to friends and relatives and just anyone who's inquiring.
That's helpful. Well, before we go, I want to give you the last word. What do you want to say about the book that you haven't already said that's important to our listeners? And after that, tell us how people can connect with you on social media.
So what I'm really excited about is the person of Jesus. And, you know, the reason I think we need to trust the Gospels is because they are how we find out about Jesus. So I'm very excited to get people reading the Gospels, and above all, you know, recognize that the Word of God is very special. It only takes about 9 hours to read all of the Gospels. So I'd say start by reading that. And, you know, read this book as an accompaniment to show you how they're trustworthy. But the evidence is there within the Gospels. As for social media, my main medium is Twitter. So I'm Dr. PJ Williams. So that's Dr. no dot PJ Williams. Or you begin with the @ sign. And I try and tweet a few times a week and do some quite long threads sometimes.
Yes, your thread on David and Goliath was really helpful. I enjoyed that.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Williams, and I hope people will get your book. This has been a very rich conversation, and I appreciate your time so much.
Well, thank you.